Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. Hope you all had a good break. Welcome to the plenary session on the post-2025 geostrategy implementation. My name is Justina Nichinska. I'm based at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, and I'm also one of the GEO Program Board co-chairs. I am joined this afternoon by a panel of experts who will speak to you about their perspectives on GEO's post-2025 implementation. They include Ms. Katie Matthews from NOAA, Dr. Franz Imler from the European Commission, Dr. Alice Hughes from University of Hong Kong, Mr. Titus Latapo from the Serara Foundation, and Mr. Andy Murdoch from the GEO Secretariat. As you heard this morning, we are at a pivotal time for GEO right now in a very exciting phase in the development of GEO's future vision. We're really implementing the post-25 strategy of Earth intelligence for all. And as we talked about this morning, it's really about transformative programs, innovation, developing the future vision of GEO, and finding new ways and innovative opportunities that will challenge us to create those solutions that we talked about. So this is an ambitious plan, and we're really looking to this session to learn from you and our panel of experts about what you see, what we can do in terms of implementation, how we implement this strategy, what specific actions can be taken, and how as a GEO community we can come together to really launch this futuristic plan. During this session, you will hear a series of updates from Mr. Murdoch about the post-25 implementation and essentially what has taken place to date. You'll hear about the 4 pillars of that strategy, which include the post-2025 GEO work program, communications and resource mobilization, community and governance, as well as GEO Secretariat Administration and Operations. After that, we will have 2 presentations that will focus on a couple of key elements of that strategy, which include youth engagement and Indigenous engagement, and we'll hear perspectives from Dr. Hughes and Mr. Latapo on that. Following this, we will have a discussion with our panel of experts to really talk about their views on implementation, and we'll then open up the discussion to all of you to answer questions, interact with the panel, and provide your perspectives. So with that, thank you very much for joining the session. We hope to have a very good interactive discussion and really want to focus on obtaining key outcomes coming out of this session as recommendations for the future in terms of how we implement the strategy. With that, I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Andy Murdoch, who is the lead at the GEO Secretariat for the post-2025 strategy implementation plan. With that, over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone. Yeah, so I'm Andy Murdoch with the GEO Secretariat, and yeah, I'll be coordinating the inputs that leads to the creation of the implementation plan for the post-2025 strategy for GEO. So the aims of the session are really just to give you a bit of an update on where we are with the SIP, to share our thoughts on how we think we can deliver Earth intelligence for all. And we've already heard this morning some ideas in that regard. We're going to hear some insights from two key areas, the youth and engagement piece, as we've heard. And we'll also get to hear from our panel. So what we're trying to do with this session is to get people's views and to feed that into the implementation plan. So that's the outline for the session that Justina's just covered. And so really I want to get into where we are at the moment with the preparation of the SIP, the Strategy Implementation Plan, or SIP for short. And essentially where we're coming from is we have the post-2025 strategy goals, really trying to set out this vision for Earth intelligence for all. And each one of the goals has Earth intelligence at its heart. It's trying to co-produce transformative programs that will deliver Earth intelligence. And again, we'll hear about how that works through the work program. We want to ensure that there's global equity in terms of making sure that the Earth intelligence that we produce is accessible. We want to integrate new technologies and innovations. So I was sat in the session on AI just now, which was really interesting, talking about how we can implement changes and use AI to really power forward what we're trying to achieve with these bigger global challenges. We want to increase participation in young people and draw in the insights that they get, and also invest in integrated communications and advocacy to make sure we communicate the impact of GEO and also raise awareness of our activities and our impacts. So obviously the implementation plan is very similar to the theme for this particular symposium. You know, we're trying to take a vision into action, and I'm going to set out in a few slides just how we plan to do that. So essentially, what we're trying to do is move from a set of broad goals that are intentionally broad, defined in the strategy, to try to work out how we deliver the success that we want. So we have a number of success measures as well in the strategy, and we want to know how we're succeeding. So the key point of this whole session for me is to start to understand how are we going to implement this change. And to do that, we need to break the goals down further into more specific action. And we also heard from Jana this morning. She challenged you to find new ways of doing things, new approaches and methods to the way that we're doing it now. But we also need to recognize that that's not just a technical thing. There's a lot of technical questions, trying to go from making sure that the Earth intelligence is delivered faster, that it's more efficient, etc., and getting to the people who need it when it's needed. But there's also a lot of governance issues around making that happen. So recognizing that there's that sort of challenge as well. So in terms of how we move from the vision to the action, essentially what we're doing is we're taking success measures and goals from the strategy and trying to set out with the implementation plan how we're going to do it. So describing in more detail how we break those goals down into more specific objectives. So just like you would with a processing problem in Earth observation, you've got an overall goal, but you need to break it down into processing steps. That's what we're aiming to do with the strategy. And then within those more generic objectives, defining specific actions that will allow us to implement the change. So what we're going to do, who's going to do it, and things like that. And so we're organizing ourselves in these 4 SIP pillars, and essentially this is how we're developing the activities and how we're going to coordinate ourselves. So the first is the work program that delivers all of GEO's Earth observation activities. We've got communications and resource mobilization, which obviously communicates our message and demonstrates impact, which hopefully will lead to the mobilization of resources to support our mission. And then also looking at community and governance, which is obviously looking after the needs of our members, but also working out how the organization as a whole is governed. And once we've worked out what the needs are for those 3 pillars, we really want to then work out how we create an operating model that's fit for purpose. So the final pillar is administration and operations, which will be responsive to those needs. So each of the individual pillars has already been working really hard, and you're going to hear a lot more from Christina and colleagues on the work programme, but also from Nicoletta and her colleagues on the communication side, and various other aspects of the work that's gone on so far in more detail. So I won't go into huge amounts of detail now, but what I will say is just give you a few examples of the sorts of things that we're doing and how it maps to the goals of the strategy. So if we take the work programme, the goal in the strategy is clearly defined. You know, we're trying to co-produce transformative programmes to deliver trusted Earth intelligence. So what we're trying to do here is ensure that the individual activities respond to strategic opportunities, that they increase GEO's relevance, impact, and additionality. And so one of the ways, and one of the proposed structures here, oh wow, okay. I don't think that's quite right. That's not quite right. Yeah. Okay. So one of the proposed ways to do that is the new GEO work programme structure. So the post-2025 work programme structure, which has the new R2O pipeline, this research to operation pipeline, designed to make sure that we don't just let activities stagnate, that they develop and progress through to more mature activities into the future. And then also we have this cross-cutting themes. So it's the 6 thematic and the 2 cross-cutting focus areas rather, which really helped us to prioritize our work. And then finally, we're looking at options like a catalyst fund for new innovation. And so the PB's been thinking, the programme board's been thinking very hard about new ways to deliver these activities and impact through the work programme. Let me come to the communications and resource mobilisation pillar. And really, this is about trying to make GEO's value and make sure that it's effectively communicated so that it drives engagement, trust, and increases the financial support. So again, we've got various examples that break that down further, but then the idea is to try to co-create new content, for example, with leading global platforms like UN and WEF, that we might produce physical things for the website, like some authoritative videos demonstrating. We're going to be hearing a lot more about the brand book, and there's a specific session on communications later today. And then also developing a set of champions. So there's various activities that, again, are going on around that, but we also need additional ideas from yourselves about how we can get across the message and raise funds for and mobilize resources for GEO's mission. In terms of community and governance, we're looking to increase member engagement. So to make sure that it's fit for purpose, the governance of GEO. So that may require some changes in rules and procedures. We're also looking at maybe having permanent secretariat functions in the region of GEOs, and also trying to aim for targeted member engagement in underrepresented regions. And then, as we'll hear, you know, we're also really keen to strengthen the participation of Indigenous peoples and other underrepresented communities. So in order to do that, there's the suggestion for an EDI fund with specific targeted financial assistance, some live interpretation services standard, and fellowships for up to 4 posts. So once we've set out all the actions, and obviously we've got still a way to go to do that, we're listening to feedback from yourselves and also putting out ideas for you to knock down or to extend upon. We need to set out the resources needed, the timeline, the tools that are going to be used, various roles and responsibilities. So who's going to do it? When are they going to do it? Then we also identify the dependencies between the pillars and the risks, and then also set out more detailed and measurable success criteria. So that's the aim. We aim to have a draft of the SIP available for XCOM in November. We're going to update that following feedback, and then aim to circulate that more widely for review in January 2025, and then also prepare a final version for 2025 as well, March 2025. And the idea is that we will aim for approval in Rome at the plenary. So just to finish on, we obviously have some ideas. We're going to talk a lot more in the next few days about the ideas that we've got for the SIP, but we also really value your input as well. So at the back of the room, nicely laid out on the table in the top right-hand corner, left-hand corner, you'll see these little cards and you'll see posters dotted around the place. Really encourage you to take part in our online survey, which will give you a chance to provide more detailed feedback and suggestions for us. And yeah, we're very much looking forward to hearing your views so that we can make Earth intelligence for all a reality. So yeah, I encourage you to fill out the form, but that's all from me.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation, Andy. I do have one question for you, which is, what would you like to see as the outcomes for this session and for the symposium?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think just going back to the how, really, you know, we know that there's quite a considerable amount of things that we would like to change, but some of them aren't that easy. You know, some of them are quite challenging. You know, I think we need to think about how we move from, you know, we talk about things like analysis-ready data. One of the big challenges is getting to the end user. How do we get to the end user? How do we get to decision-ready products and services? That's where I think we need to aim on a technical level. And so for this session, really, what I'm hoping to get out of it is just to understand, you know, your thoughts on how we do that. You know, how do we reach the firemen tackling the fire in an emergency situation? How do we reach individual farmers? How do we get our information to an MP in a ministerial brief in a way that he can understand? You know, there's some really simple outputs that I think we could create from Earth Intelligence. And at the moment, we tend to focus a lot on the platforms and the process. We now need to get it in the hands of decision makers who can really, you know, make and deliver that impact. So I think for me, that's the big takeaway that I'd like to get out today.
Thank you for that, Andy. It's definitely most important to connect with the users on the ground, those who need the data the most. With that, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Alice Hughes, who's an associate professor at the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Hong Kong, where she leads the Landscape Ecology Group. Alice, we welcome your perspectives on supporting inclusion of early career researchers and practitioners, please.
So thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm here to represent the youth, and so I see myself more in terms of representing my students and one of my previous roles, which was developing a capacity building committee for the Association of Tropical Biology and Conservation. And today I'm going to be talking about not only how we better include youth, but why it is imperative to do so. Not just because we need to tick that box of having that wider inclusion, but because unless we do it, we are not going to be moving in the right direction in the future. So there are multiple benefits to including the next generation. One of them is that they are digital natives. All of us in the room probably remember the first time that we were using a computer for something fairly inane. Now, 3-year-olds can use these technologies. That means that they have capacities to program in a way that for us is often challenging. It means that they can ask the questions that they need to ask and that we as societies need to ask. These upcoming scientists can also build bridges that have previously just been too difficult, but also these scientists often come from those regions where we urgently need to generate that data. And in a few slides' time, I will show you why that is just so important if we are going to fill in those gaps. It can mean that capacity building genuinely builds capacity. I've worked in the Asia-Pacific region for over 16 years. When I came to this region, the best scientists in the region were Westerners. Now that is finally changing because of a sustained dialogue with young researchers across this region. And if we genuinely want to build indicators that work, if we genuinely want to change society, it requires us to have people with the capacity in these regions who also understand how societies operate. It means making sure that we have scientific and environmental literacy at all levels. And it means that those representatives who go to the COP from across these regions understand what these products look like, understand why they are important, and understand why it's important that we have programs that train those next generations and that they invest in the sciences as well. However, of course, there are barriers. I'm going to only mention this briefly because I think these are dialogues we need to continue to have, but we need to make sure we ensure inclusion. That means in person, because there is no substitute for coming to these meetings. We all know that often the most important thing that we get out of these meetings is not the people standing at the front like me, it's the discussions you have over your lunch break, over your coffee. It's meeting that scientist who actually gives you your ticket to the next thing you do. And so there is no replacement to these physical meetings. That means considering things that may seem fairly inane, like when do you send out the visa letters? How easy it is? Are there difficult requirements? Because otherwise you can't get those young scientists into the room. It also means that we need to get better at using online technologies, hosting not only your Zoom meeting, but then your breakout room where you have the more interesting discussion. And the other importance of that is that young scientists who aren't speaking their native language, they're probably not going to be able to ask a question in a big forum. It's too intimidating. But by having breakouts, you can bring them into the conversation. And that conversation can go anywhere, but it also means that they feel like they're part of the community. And it also means they begin to grow the network that takes them forward into the future. And as a major part of this, the initiative from GEO that was launched in Cape Town, the first GEO Youth Declaration, showcases some of the major initiatives that GEO is committing to help include that next generation and to make sure that they are part of the conversation. When we're thinking about these barriers, of course, as I said, not all of them are as obvious as they could be. And we do need to do better to make sure that we have all of those different elements of inclusion. It means that we also, as I've said, need to think about how we make those resources available in the longer term. As a person who lives in Asia, I'm all too familiar with the midnight meetings because everything has to be on US or European time. If we have platforms to allow streaming, repetition of talks, repeating them and pressing pause so you can translate them, again, we increase access to parts of the world that otherwise just aren't going to be awake for those sessions. It may seem basic, but these things can make all the difference between having inclusion and not having inclusion. And furthermore, by having these sessions, especially for students in remote institutions, they do not have firsthand access to these resources. By providing them online, by creating syllabuses that showcase what Earth intelligence genuinely looks like, you put those keys into their hands and they can unlock any door with them. So what do we mean by global? We've all read the studies where we have these global parts of the world that are the low diversity regions of high income economies. And almost every study you see will have global in the title, but that's the only place you really find global. Biodiversity remains in the world's tropics. Unless we have a better representation, we will not include those regions. The way we do that isn't just by working with established scientists. It's working with upcoming scientists who will build capacity when they go back home. In fact, if you look at platforms, so this is from eBird, we can see that almost 3/4 of eBird data is from the Nearctic, North America. Where do you think 3/4 of the world's bird species are? And even when we grow more data in places we have data. That won't change unless we build capacity and inclusion and make everyone feel like they are part of the conversation and that those views matter. We need to have coordinated networks, and that starts by using initiatives like GEO to engage with the youth and make them feel like part of the network. And once you set that seed, it will grow into a tree. They will train students within their own institutions, and you will have homegrown capacity because they have their entire careers ahead of them, and they are the ones who can make the difference. And I thought I would give an example of what global should look like. This was a study led by my former student. On the bottom, this is the Bat Cave Vulnerability Index. The bottom was created with a network, largely of young, early career researchers from all over the world, with almost 2,000 caves. And we assessed the vulnerability of those different ecosystems. And we found that actually there were 28%, almost 30% of those caves were high risk and high diversity. When we use the IUCN data, almost 90% of the caves were low priority. That was only possible because of early career researchers using an early career network. And by using these kinds of studies, we can continue to generate the data we need to validate those global surveys. And that is also true within the context of other parts of GEO. So with the launch of the new products of the global ecosystems and the Global Ecosystem Atlas, unless we have good reflection of people across the world, we won't have the calibration and validation data. And so it's not a question of ticking a box by including youth. It's a question of where do we want to be in 20 years' time? How do we build better targets? How do we ensure that policymakers understand the value of geospatial data? And given that those are things that everyone in this room cares about, if we invest in youth, it will pay us back by taking us in the right direction tomorrow and generating the data we need to reach these targets. So thank you, and of course, happy to take any questions.
Alice, thank you so much for that very powerful message. I think it's very clear that engaging youth really means providing effective capacity development. That came very strongly. Now that we're looking at the next work program and the next structure of GEO, how would you say we could meaningfully engage youth in those structures as we move forward to kind of eliminate those silos and really make sure they're embedded in the work as we move forward?
So that's a really good question. And Andy's talk before mine also reminded me of another point that needs to come into that equation. First off, when we're thinking about the skills they need and bridging those gaps, breaking down the silos, I'm someone who comes from primarily an ecology background, but I've also worked with geospatial data my entire research career. There are not enough ecologists who are really literate in terms of how we effectively use geospatial data, what the assumptions are, what the limitations are. These are discussions we need to be having and information we need to make available. So things like webinar series where we have those discussion groups, those breakouts to really drive home the points are really important. The next step is taking it a step further. How do we change the real world? How do we translate this data into policy to have an effect? And I mentioned the fact that we want those next generation of scientists to be the ones representing their countries as the party representatives in organizations like the CBD. That means we need to take that next step and think about how are we using these products? What do we need? What discussions should we be having with organizations like the CBD? And I know these discussions are ongoing, but we need to bring in that next generation and think about those forms of environmental literacy so they understand how to translate it and where those knowledge gaps are that are going to drive change. What do we need for better indicators? Because if we have their inputs when they've been on the ground, not only will we develop better indicators, but we will be working in partnership to make sure we are developing what we need. They are getting the skills they need, but we are learning what questions are relevant, because often what we think is relevant is not what they are seeing on the ground. And so it is a two-way dialogue that starts off through these webinars and things so that you can really have those discussions.
Thank you, Alice. Great combination of co-development and mentorship is very important. Our next speaker is Mr. Titus Latapo, who is the co-founder of the GEO Indigenous Alliance and managing director of the Sarara Foundation. He's also a member of the Samburu tribe in Kenya and a champion of community-based conservation efforts in northern Kenya. And we welcome Titus to speak to us about Indigenous engagement in the post-2025 GEO work program implementation. Over to you, Titus.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So I think my name is Titus Letapo, a co-founder of Indigenous People Alliance and also a Samburu by tribe. And I also come from a northern part of Kenya. GEO Indigenous Alliance was established in 2019 in Canberra, Australia. and it was formed because of the gaps that are available within GEO. And thank you, GEO Secretariat, because you have worked with us, and we have worked closely with you. The mission, our mission is to advocate for and enhance indigenous access to Earth observation data and tools. It is an honor for me to talk in front of you today. Representation to us doesn't only mean the presence. It involves the recognition of our rights, knowledge, and integrity within for the indigenous people. For long, indigenous voices has been sidelined or reduced to tokenism and global discussion, particularly in areas of impacting our land and resources. From indigenous perspective, true representation means having our indigenous leaders who carry the authority of their tribes actively participating or involved in discussion, making processes that affect our communities and the environment. This is especially critical for climate action. Indigenous people are the stewards of biodiversity and traditional systems that have sustained ecosystem for generations. By integrating our insights, GEO community can enhance the activities effectiveness of climate action. When indigenous voices are genuinely included, it leads to more comprehensive and equitable solutions that address both local and global challenges. When we talk about meaningful engagement, this one goes beyond consultation. It requires commitment through partnership between indigenous communities and academic institutions. This also distinguishes between projects that involves indigenous peoples and those that are led by us is critical. Genuine co-designing means that indigenous voices are not just heard, but actively shape every aspect of the project from the onset. For example, just to give an example of Samburu community or Samburu tribe, we have traditional knowledge about our land. We manage our own land, and that has been passed down by generations, generation to generations. When scientists, let's say projects, comes in and neglect our knowledge, there is a risk of implementing solutions that are not effective or even detrimental to our ecosystem. For example, just to give one example, if a project aims to protect in protecting wildlife, habitat, and sometimes, let's say, overlooking the traditional knowledge of our of the community, just to give an example, let's say grazing patterns. This one will create conflict between the community or maybe herders and wildlife and livestock. And by the end of the day, undermining the conservation efforts and our livelihoods within the community. That's why GEO Indigenous Alliance advocates for adherence to free, prior, and informed consents. The principle, in principle, that ensures that indigenous people have their rights and give without consent to any project affecting their land, resources, and livelihood. It's not just a legal obligation. It is a vital framework for establishing trust, respect in our relationship between researchers and the policymakers. To emphasize this point, consider the impact of the United Nations declarations on indigenous people rights that provide clear mandate and collaboration, outlining the rights of indigenous people to participate in decision-making processes. The GEO community should also embrace these rights and prioritize indigenous-led initiatives, and that co-design processes that are conducted with transparency and respect. In conclusion, while we have made significant strides in advancing indigenous representation and inclusion, in scientific dialogue. We will have a long way to go. The GEO Indigenous Alliance remains unfounded, severely hindering our ability to effective solution to our communities and environment. This lack of funding perpetuates inequalities and divide, limiting our capacity to lead projects that reflect our knowledge and address the challenges that we face. I urge each of you to advocate the increased support and recognition of the GEO Indigenous Alliance in ensuring that our voices are not only heard, but that we have the necessary resources to act. This is your opportunity to build a future where true collaboration exists, where Indigenous knowledge is respected and integrated, and where every community can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Titus. Very much appreciate those perspectives. And it's clear that we definitely need to engage Indigenous peoples early on and to have full inclusivity for the GeoWork program. I did have a follow-up question for you in terms of how can Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional Earth-based observation approaches co-create a more holistic approach towards delivering Earth intelligence for all?
Yeah, this one can be achieved by making sure that Indigenous people are involved in every step. And again, during co-designing of major tools, Indigenous communities are engaged and working with the teams that are designing the tools. And again, finding entry points that enables those who are developing the tools or maybe GEO to enable them maybe reach out to the communities, and also making sure that the communities participate within these processes and the steps that are being taken.
Thank you, Titus. I think those entry points will be very important as we look to designing the next work program. With this, we'd like to move on to the next part of the panel, which is to include the rest of our experts in discussions. And thank you. And with that, we'll have a series of questions posed to the panel members, and they'll have a couple of minutes to respond each. With that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Katie Matthews, who currently serves as the GEO-NCS team lead at the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration at NOAA. She leads coordination of U.S. interagency policy and observations, and also as the U.S. GEO focal point. With that, Katie, first question to you. Successful resource mobilization really often depends on how well an organization communicates its impact. Can you give examples and sharing achievements and results with stakeholders and donors and policymakers helps to secure funding resources?
Yes. Okay, so I think one of the things that is wholly undervalued as we think about the value chain for these projects, both in the current and in the future work program, is how communications can help us build that story that leads to increased resource mobilization. We hear a lot about how different initiatives want more funding to help grow, to help scale. And one of the key ways in my mind to do that is through improving our communication. And I continue to be amazed by the products and services that this community, especially as a non-scientist, the products and services that this community is putting out. I'm every day just excited to see what kind of the next item is. And one of the things that we can do better, though, I think, is how do we tell the value of those applications, of those products and services? I think that we really need to continue to work on our why. Why should people care? Why, in particular, should a policymaker care about investing in a particular product or service? So one of the, I think it's really important as we do that to think about plain language as well. Who has a need? What is the gap? And why is the service able to provide value to meet that gap? And notice I did not say, tell me about the tool. I did not, it's not about the actual tool itself. So let me give you one example. It is the initiative. Is it an initiative? It's an initiative, GeoGloss. GeoGloss is an online streamflow forecasting service that provides reliable 15-day forecasts and 80 years of historical streamflow data. I'm just telling you that for context. But what we did in the United States is there was a demonstrated need for forecasting to assist with river flooding. There were gaps in situ observations in many parts of the world that were needed to help provide life-saving forecasts. There was this tool, and when implemented, we have examples in Malawi where the forecasting service enabled a savings they estimate at $1.5 billion in losses. And there's another example in Honduras where the use of the forecasting service to manage their reservoir and dams led to billions of dollars less in agricultural losses during a hurricane. And so we were able to show that value and to provide the information about how we could scale to other countries. And based on that, we were able to get our policymakers in the United States to commit an extra $2 million to expand this service to 5 more countries in Africa, with potentially more if funding was available. And so that's just one example of how we use communication. Again, we didn't really talk about the tool itself. It was the value that came from the tool that was the more important aspect in communicating. And so there is a intrinsic link between our ability to communicate effectively in plain language and resource mobilization in our community. And I think that that is true from our flagships all the way down to new ideas that we are about to propose as part of this new work program. And I think that, I use an example from within the United States, but let's start to think about how we collectively can use communication to gain resource mobilization around the world going forward. And I think we could have a lot of success working on this together. I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Katie. Those are excellent points on identifying the who, the gap, and the how, and using clear language to do so. I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to comment on points that Katie made. Any reflections?
I will probably give some points in a second.
Okay.
That
Well,
expand on it.
I think it's also really good to know we had a GEO Secretariat organize a workshop yesterday on essentially just that, the story mapping, and that's a great example of how we can, as a community, look to develop the kinds of skill sets that are needed to really clearly, effectively communicate the value of what we're doing to a lay audience. And that's a great example, Katie, with GeoGloss.
Yeah, I think the other thing to say there is we're talking about trusted Earth intelligence in the delivery of these services. And obviously, if we're expecting people to trust what's inside the black box, we need to communicate that very clearly to decision makers who aren't necessarily technical people. So yeah, I think we have to be careful on our messaging there.
Thanks, Andy. Well, with that, we are moving on to our next speaker for comments. And our next speaker, Dr. Franz Imler, leads the environmental observation sector at the European Commission, focusing on non-space activities and collaborations of GEO, the WMO, ESA, and EA. Franz, a question to you is really based on your experience in EuroGeo. What were the key ingredients needed to provide actionable information to users and communities in your region?
Thanks for the question. Well, obviously, the first thing is to involve the users, to start with the users. We had a project called eShape that developed actually a co-design methodology. And I don't think you can develop Earth intelligence without talking with the user from the beginning, the end user, and involve the users throughout the development of these services. This is certainly absolute essential, but it is very challenging. I think in Europe, we had some good examples where it worked well with end users that came more from with a more technical background, like water managers or in the energy sector. But as further away from some scientific technical background people are, farmers, local authorities, the more difficult it gets. You need people, you need to involve people that speak the language of these people. And that's already a big challenge if you come over, if you work, with research project where you essentially have researchers in your team. So that's, I think, one of the challenges where we made some advancements, but there's certainly still remains quite a big task. So the other question is who will these users be that we are actually targeting? And of course, I mean, one is so to say the people in the countries. That will be very challenging. Or are we more targeting big organizations, United Nations organizations, governments? That may be a bit more easy for us, in particular as GEO is an intergovernmental organization and we have the people from the governments right here. So working with governments could be in the first place probably be more rewarding than trying to reach out to people all over the place. So governments are anyway an important interlocutor, and that brings you to my second point, because we need two things: mobilize resources. Katie already mentioned. Therefore, we need mainly the governments, and also very important to make data available, because most data is produced by governmental organizations or organizations funded by governments. And there in Europe, of course, we're in quite a reasonable, comfortable position because we have Copernicus, which provides open access to all its data, and many other organizations. We have now a Data Act that obliges governments to make all essential data available, including, for example, meteorological observations, etc. So there we are in Europe, I think, in a good situation. But outside Europe, it gets a lot more challenging. And I think that's also an aspect that GEO may want to address, is that I hear from people working, for example, in Africa, it's very hard to get data in these countries, in situ data, river gorges, etc. And this is something that we need to work on. There will also not be Earth intelligence without open access to these data, I'm pretty convinced. Then another potential user or collaborator will be the private sector. And that's also a challenge, I think, for GEO. We don't really see much of the private sector, for example, here in this symposium, as far as I can see. We have in Europe, we have a quite active and successful private sector, from small and medium-sized enterprises in particular, that actually sell Earth intelligence to various users, insurance companies, etc. So there's probably something we should look into and learn from that, because they know how to do it, in fact. And we need to collaborate with these people probably a bit better. But also, of course, private sector will be end users as such, and we need to discuss with them. So the last aspect is, how do we operationalize? That is one aspect that has been mentioned in the implementation plan, or actually commercialize. It's also one way of operationalize services and making them available on a long-term basis if you are commercially successful. That's again where the private sector comes in. There in Europe, I think we are in a reasonably comfortable situation. We have Copernicus services, so we managed to get things that we developed into operations from Copernicus services. So again, that's public services that make these services available, and it is not an easy task. So it's something that really needs to be reflected on from the beginning. How do you achieve this? Because research is one thing, and getting this really into an operational job, there's quite a few miles to go in between. So, yeah, maybe I leave it there for the time being.
So I'm going to build on that and on the examples, because I agree that collaboration and understanding what end users need is essential for making sure that the products being developed not only fit that need, but the end users understand the inherent assumptions. So within APBON, the Asia Pacific Biodiversity Observation Network, we are now trying to strengthen the links to AOGO because of that need for regional data where there is a complete understanding of what the resolution is across space, time, etc., making sure that we have the products we need. In addition, to answer the questions of tomorrow, we need to make sure we have that cross-reference. So for example, having good indices of degradation in grasslands, because most of the global maps of grasslands, we can say it's grass, but is it natural grassland? Is it degraded? We can only calibrate that form of data where we have collaborations between ecologists who go on the ground. Maybe they are calibrating it with local hyperspectral imagery and then comparing it to something from Copernicus or Sentinel. For those kinds of use, for those kinds of data generation, we cannot do it without collaboration. And when we are moving forwards towards any of the global biodiversity targets, we cannot capture that nuance without actual collaborations. Lastly, we've all just come through a pandemic. One Health is something that we are increasingly realizing the importance of. And yet there are still remarkably few collaborations that are really looking at One Health from the landscape perspective, intersecting species health, ecosystem health, looking at what degradation and fragmentation means from those different perspectives. And those can only be done with collaborations that start out at the beginning when we are generating the question, thinking about the kinds of data we need. So to make sure we are future ready, we need to be calibrating that data and developing those collaborations today, because these can only be done by true partnerships. And I'm really happy that GEO and GeoBon have a joint pavilion within Cali, because it means we can keep on having those dialogues. And with hopefully the realization of GBIOS, the Global Biodiversity Observation System, which is GeoBon, it's only possible through collaborations with GEO, making sure things like the essential biodiversity variables make sense at all scales and resolutions. And so we need to have those collaborations right throughout the process if we are going to develop better data that helps us answer the questions we need to be answering.
Thank you very much for that, Alice, and thank you for that, Franz. I think those are great perspectives on user engagement. And I think certainly as we look to the next work program, next version of GEO, we're very much stressing the importance of user engagement starting early on at the beginning, identifying those users, but also breaking the silos you talked about. How do we bring in other partnerships? How do we bring in the private sector? How do we have those conversations early on to ensure that kind of necessary coordination? Katie?
I just want to add, I think that this just points out how hard a job Andy has in putting together this strategic implementation plan, because these silos are not silos. These pillars are not silos. They are clearly very interconnected. And so it's going to be very important for us to look at where those connectivity links are so that we're maximizing the use of resources.
Thanks for that, Katie. I think that's just yeah.
Good luck, Andy.
Alice, I do have a follow-up question for you, which is when we're talking about user engagement, starting that early on and then bridging those gaps, and you talked about youth in terms of capacity development, how do we ensure we can engage youth, and really understand user engagement better that way through their perspective?
So I think we've touched on this, and it really is a key point. Having things like the webinar series are useful, but you don't know what people want. And so having better channels where people can share those views are one way of doing it. You also already have lots of different working groups. So having youth representatives on those groups, and I'm sure you already do, but then also having a focus group to pull that in together. And if you were then to have a webinar series, have them be the ones organizing it. Have them partnering with organizations like GeoBon so that you can have that cross-reference dialogue between them and maintain that dialogue between that diverse community of user needs. And they are the ones who are often hungry for knowledge and a little less time poor than we all feel like we are. And so they have the time to go, to pay attention, to ask the questions and to generate the next questions. And so that's how I personally, if I was at the steering wheel, would be trying to do it, because then it doesn't put a massive burden on any one individual. You just use the resources you have to help generate that and then let it grow once you've already started a program.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. And we're certainly looking at those perspectives as we look to next year, where we're going to how to embed these throughout activities and really code and develop it from the ground up. I have a follow-up question for you, Titus, which is really we're looking at how to better engage Indigenous peoples throughout GEO's work. So how would you recommend we better reflect Indigenous peoples in the governance of GEO in the future?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, indigenous communities across the world have their own leaders. And I think it's very important for institutions to identify these leaders and communicate through them and understand their needs. Number two, just maybe to add on what Alice mentioned, is always very important to maybe to identify whether the youth or even the communities have the right capacity even to understand the data or the information that is being given out. Because if you don't, if they don't understand maybe the data or the way the data has been analyzed, then it becomes useless to them. So they need to understand and to know how to interpret this data. So there is need to identify whether there is capacity gaps, and also to understand whether the leadership, those at the community level, understand the use of that data. So I think capacity building is very, very important and identifying those gaps.
Thank you, Titus. You know, I think it reflects some of Alice's points on engaging youth early on, a need for strong capacity building, that kind of real co-developed effort throughout the work we do in GEO. I'd like to bring the points back to some of the earlier discussion on resource mobilization and communication. And so this is to you, Katie. In the context of the post-2025 strategy implementation, how can GEO members work together to communicate effectively, promote the strategy's goals, and secure funding?
Okay, well, I'm going to start this answer actually with a question to the audience. Who in the audience views themselves as a communicator? Raise your hand. Okay, so we've got a handful of people. Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to that question at the end of my answer here, because what I would say is that each and every person in this room is a communicator, and that you, as part of this GEO community, have an opportunity to engage in communication throughout the process from wherever you are in your part of the kind of value chain related to your activity. Hold on, I gotta put my glasses on, I can't read my notes. So a couple of points to this. I think one, we do, as a community, need to use the resources that the GEO Secretariat is already providing us. They do a fantastic job of social media. If you are not following them on LinkedIn, you are missing out on all of the good news and things. And just as an example, there's other social media. They do some really great news stories on their website. And I think there'll be more discussion about the GEO brand book as we go throughout this week. So if you're working on a GEO work program activity, you're going to want to think about how to incorporate the GEO brand book in your communication activities. I do think that we still need some things from the Secretariat. We need to have that consistent messaging on GEO and its activities, and that these are messages that we can all individually bring back to our member countries and organizations to help kind of spread the word on the value of GEO. And so I think that is one area where the Secretariat can really help take a lead in providing consistent, regular and consistent messaging of what member states should be talking about in terms of the value. I do think, though, as I said, it can't all be the GEO Secretariat. I do think member states in particular need to avail themselves of their own communication resources and use them to also use internal resources where possible to help spread the word within their government about GEO and what it can provide, or within its national coordinating mechanism if one exists in a country. And I think that if you're on a work program activity, each work program activity really needs to be ready with that story of why. What is the value that this is bringing? And so I truly think everybody has a role in communicating about GEO. And I think this post-2025 strategy is an opportunity for us to kind of pool these collective communication resources, whether it's both the Secretariat, whether it's at the individual member state, whether it's in a work program activity, to use that to communicate that value. And it gets back to, again, this is a means to an end. We don't just do communication to do communication. This is how we end up and get to improved resource mobilization. And we need to do it both internal and to our own member states, in talking with partners, and with each work program activity to be ready to really communicate. I do want to mention there is a communication support task group. There is a meeting of that task group immediately after this session and the next session. And so if you're interested in learning more and supporting potentially future ideas of how us as a collective can work on communicating the value of the products and services that the GEO community provides, that would be great. And I think it's really easy sometimes when things get financially tight to say communications is the first to go, when that is wrong. And that's the time we need to be doubling down on communications and telling that value story. Okay, so I'm going to come back to my initial question. So who in this room is a communicator? I want to see more hands up. Thank you. Yes, good job. Everybody here has a role, and I really look forward to seeing what we collectively can create going forward.
Thanks for that point, Katie. I think it's really critical to understand that everyone that needs to communicate clearly for the goals. I think pass it on.
So I've always thought it was a real pity that scientists in general are terrible communicators. And then they'll blame the media for misrepresenting their science. The best communicators for our work is us. Unless we are going out there accurately portraying our work, we can't complain when it gets misrepresented. We can't complain when governments don't care. For my students, I teach them communication skills. I also teach them how to write scientific blogs and policy briefs. These are skills that all students in environmental sciences should know. Within a fora like GEO, you should all be teaching yourselves, being better communicators, and passing on those skills, because it is how we mobilize resources. It's how we garner support, and it's how we make sure everyone understands why Earth intelligence is important. And so what should GEO do? Well, you're already doing a tremendous job, but within that webinar series, within that curricula of key skills, those communication skills are some of the most important if those scientists are not just going to be effective at being good scientists, but in making sure that their science is recognized as having global impact. And that's not just how they get grants, but hopefully it's what motivated them into it in the first place. And there are far too many scientists who seem to have lost sight of why it matters. It matters because the work we do can have a real impact. But to do that, we need to make sure it's communicated to where it can have that impact and in a way that it is comprehensively understood. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may add one point to this, communication should ideally be two ways. And ideally, we would have two people talking. One is the problem owner that relates to the discussion we had earlier, the user talking to the solution provider. So if we get these two people or two bodies, groups talking to each other, then we would really achieve something. And then we have a story to tell, because the story we want to tell is that we have a real need, a profoundly well articulated need, and we have a potential solution. And if we tell this story, I think the funding would not be a problem.
Thank you for that, Franz. I think that is indeed an excellent point of the need for the two-way communication and the early user engagement. To that point, I have a follow-up question for you, which is really, we're looking at the successes of EuroGeo in this area. How would you replicate that for the GEO work program to make those successful in other regions or globally for GEO?
Yeah, good question. We're actually trying to do this. And again, it's not straightforward that a solution that works in one place would also work to another. We need again to start a new conversation in that sense as we just discussed, and see how we can transfer it or scale it up. But certainly that's the way to go. I don't think we need to always start from scratch. We really need to take what we have, and I think we have good solutions, and try to scale it up or replicate it elsewhere. And what we need for this, and this relates to a word that you mentioned, is partnerships. And that's again, I think, one point where GEO can play a very good role, as it brings together not only a large number of governments, but also a large number of participating organizations. So it is a forum that can really help creating those partnerships. And I believe these cross-continental partnerships are absolutely essential for achieving this. Yeah.
Thank you, that Franz. I mean, that's definitely one of the most powerful things about GEO, the variety of partnerships that we bring to the table and that we can better leverage to create successful outcomes. Anyone have any other comments on before we? Good. All right. In that case, we'll now open it up to you, the audience, to provide any comments, reflections on our discussion on the strategy and implementation plans, on any recommendations you have for us, and any questions you have of the panel. Me too. And Yana third. Mike?
Thank you, Monsieur Lee from University of Maryland. I wanted to echo what the speaker, Mr. The Alice Hungers and Katie mentioned, and I'm very excited to see this excellent discussion and big picture from GEO Secretary. And I was thinking like two aspects. One is talking about to bring more young scientists into this activity. Second is about communication. So I think for higher education as a university, I think it can play a very important role and contribute in this two aspects. So I was thinking like in the past, university always like can make some contribution for capacity building. I was thinking like in the next 10 years implementation, I would like to recommend probably thinking about taking into account the role of university and to see how university can contribute into your big picture. Thank you.
So just to make sure everyone heard the question, but we're really going to focus on the role of universities and how they can contribute to the strategy we're developing and the capacity building and youth engagement that we can go on with.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Why don't we take a couple of questions? So I had two other hands up in the back, I think.
Thank you. I'm from Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, which is based in Beijing. And thank you guys so much for your inspiring speeches and your comments. And I have a question in my mind when I hear your guys' opinions. I'm thinking about how you're going to deal with the potential interest conflicts between different parties. Because I've heard about the participatory approach you're recommending to take in terms of maybe policy designing, policy implementation. I'm thinking that you are going to include so many parties, so many different groups into this process. If there is any like interest or conflict occur, how are you going to resolve those conflicts? And I've heard about like a public-private partnership that is used to solve the infrastructure gap in Africa. I don't know whether you have heard about this. It's basically to channel the resources of the private sector to solve a international problem that is mentioned by the SDGs. But during this process, they found that there is an interest conflict between the end users and the investors. And this is a really big problem in terms of like achieving profit maximization of these policies. So how are you going to solve this kind of problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question on how to really resolve potential tensions between different users and different stakeholders in the process. We'll take one more question. We'll let the panel answer the first round.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel for a very great interesting discussion. My name is Bente Liljaby. I come from Norway, and I do have a background as a worker in a funding agency. So France, you were mentioning the need of actually sharing data. But at CATI, you were mentioning that we should tell the story about the end user. Now, I want to ask you if you have thought about the fact that in order to share the data, that requires some resources. So even before you reach the end user, you need some funding. And I think maybe Alice was mentioning briefly, you actually need resources to do the metadata, you know, the nitty-gritty stuff that is necessary for sharing the data. Has this been discussed in your group?
Thank you for that, Bente. It's a good question, but how do you get the seed funding to begin the work? And with that, before we take more questions, I'll take it over to panel to provide answers.
Yep. So on the first question on university engagement, my salary comes from a university. So yes, I think universities should be involved. I also think that it's essential that universities get better at measuring other forms of impact, because for all of those of you in the audience know, if you work for universities, this kind of work rarely gets regarded in terms of what your day job is. And that makes it very hard, particularly for young scientists who are trying to climb up the ladder, to do the work that really motivates them and actually get a promotion and have a stable job. So it's not just training the next generation, it's allowing them to have a diversity of impacts. And universities in some parts of the world are getting much better at recognizing this, but in other parts, it's still remarkably challenging to go out there and actually really do something with your data, because it's not what the university values. In terms of conflicts of interest, it's always massively challenging. So within AP Bonn, Asia has more than half the world's population. It has every basically religious group. It has a massive diversity of languages. And having partners across this region, it's really challenging. And something that we are trying to do at the moment is work out what data exists, if it's public, private, or government. And if it's sitting in a government repository, why isn't it being shared? It is a massively challenging problem. And yet, as we move into the future, unless we mobilize that data, those gaps are going to stay present. Within the World Database of Protected Areas, they have found ways of kind of trying to bridge that gap. So a number of countries that don't want to publicly make that data available provides it to WDPA. They generate statistics based on the accurate data, but they don't share the raw data. And so in some instances, the way we avoid those kinds of conflicts and the problems with data sharing is we listen, we work out what the problems are, and we try to find solutions so we can get where we want to go, even if we don't mobilize everything. The other part of the question in terms of genuine conflicts, banks are becoming increasingly aware of their environmental responsibilities. That means having proper environmental impact assessments and not funding projects which are clearly not sustainable. Organizations like GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, are now trying to work to mobilize the data generated by those EIAs, because otherwise that data never becomes public and those areas being developed still never have that data. But also we have no capacity to monitor what's happening because we don't have the baseline data. And so those kinds of discussions can be had at all levels. And of course, given the wealth of data being generated by organizations like GEO, should certainly include GEO, because otherwise we don't get that baseline data. And in terms of the metadata generation, grants should make it mandatory to share that data. Funding for things like EIAs should also have requirements of sharing that data, because the metadata is what makes data usable. We need to make sure it's being used correctly and follows fair and care protocols. And that means looking at what funds the data and making sure that all of those requirements are met.
Yes, I think, Bente, you raise a very important point. We always talk about free and open data, but in fact, there's no such thing as free data. Observing the environment costs a lot of money and somebody needs to pay for that. And that's either the taxpayer or it's somebody else. So either you charge it. So that's true. We we are used, at least in Europe or in US, that it's governmentally funded, but that's not always possible. So it's a very valid point, and we probably in some cases need to think about that a bit more carefully, how we do it. It's always better than that people are charged to pay for data than not having data at all. I do think there could still be, in such a case, some sort of an open data policy, that data can be still made available also to other users, something like that. But I think you have a good point there.
So thank you very much for those points. With that, we had a couple more questions. I see Yana, and there was, yep. Did we want?
Thank you again to our panel. I'm Vani Koreisamanunu. I represent my organization, which is the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. And our mandate is protecting the natural resources and the environment for the Pacific region. I must commend our panelists for the great presentations and for sharing most of what the crop agencies who are looking after the Pacific region have been advocating for, which is on capacity building, on creating awareness, inclusivity of our communities, our traditional leaders. And yes, that was a very good question by my colleague at the back in terms of funding, which we know, thank you again for that, Franz, that nothing is free. But like I mentioned, it's just an experience from a crop agency's perspective in how does GEO, how can we use products that we can advocate for the communities, like the end users? Because one of the drawbacks that we face is trying to make them understand what are some of the products that they can be using. We all know they are not familiar in terms of Earth observations, but having products that they can visually see that has an impact on their community can be a start, especially these are for our local communities. So that's just a perspective from my end. No questions to our panelists, but just thanking you all for raising these very important issues that we are all facing. Thank you.
And thank you for raising that point, which is very significant, which is how to make information well communicated and visually relevant for users so they can better understand what the impact is. Any other questions before we turn this over to our panel?
Hello, everyone. I'm Faisal Mumtaz from Aerospace Information Research Institute, Chinese Academy of Sciences. Actually, last 2 weeks ago, we have attended the AOGEO symposium in Japan. There we have just I have put some suggestions in front of Andrew, which I would just like to revise again. There we just talk about every task group or everyone, they are just working on different topics, or they have generated several reports, several papers, something. and GEO already have the 60 or maybe 90 members countries, something like that. But still, somewhere we are just facing the problems with the like implementations of their reports or their something. So I think GEO, somewhere GEO should just mobilize their members countries for the implementations of that scientific research or something. Now, like for example, from this morning, we are talking about to like put the AI to the space or somewhere. Even though on this earth we have several problems, let's fix that one first, then talk about the space or something. The second one, I will just agree with the Alice. Alice was talking about the engaging the youth, in the GEO or something, and also maybe the symposium, online training, something is not enough. Somewhere GEO have opened the they have distributed the calls for the projects or something just 2 or 3 days ago. Why don't we open the calls for the young researchers? They just like submit their plans, their proposals to the GEO. GEO can mobilize that one. They can just distribute that one. And like, for example, maybe if that youth, the young researcher, he have a good team, he put some professional supervisor or someone, maybe he can win a funding when he will have a funding with in hand. Like, for example, a researcher, he have an idea, he have no fundings, even though like this morning or even this session, we have talked too much about the funding. For example, a researcher, he don't have the funds. He's just contacting everyone, but no one is just replying. But maybe they say that we don't have any project or we don't have funds. It's mean that we are going to waste that talent or something. So why don't GEO just open that call for projects for the youth? Then youth, like that young researcher, they just file their proposal or something. So by that way, let's bring the youth up, not like just what we can do, because if we will ask everyone what we can do for the youth, it's a long debate, and maybe everybody will have their own suggestions or something. I think somewhere GEO should mobilize the youth. Firstly, let's listen them what exactly they want, what kind of plans they have, what they can serve for the GEO, how they can serve for the Earth intelligence and everything. Then let's move.
So thank you. Great question. And like, how do we engage youth in our call for proposals and our activities moving forward, mobilize funding? I will take one last question. I believe the gentleman, Niana, go ahead.
It's a good thing I waited because I didn't want to be the first one to say the word funding. So now 3 people have come before me and said the word, the F word, funding. Thanks for the panelists. But I think for me, you guys didn't push it far enough. Some questions were answered with questions. How do we go in front of the policy communities? How do we do this? So how do we do this? How do we provide consistent messaging? So I just want to quickly address some of the things I've heard, because some things are available already. At Katie, indeed, follow us on social media because consistent messaging is available. Matt Crook, where are you, Matt? Our amazing digital media communications expert, linking the work of GEO to things that are popping up on the landscape. You heard me this morning talk about the World Economic Forum report that identifies the need. It comes from the user side. It comes from the industry sectors, 6 sectors: agriculture, oil and gas mining, insurance, supply chain and transport, electricity and utilities, public works and emergency services. Just these 6 sectors alone represent 64% of that $3.8 trillion global GDP value cumulative that's anticipated, which assumes this industry will use Earth observation. Matt connected the work that GEO does to that report, to those requirements. So the messaging in terms of how GEO is already positioned to support and bridge that gap is there. Now, how do we go in front of those sectors? How do we package our work and present our offering, the services, the applications that, Katie, you marvel at every day? How do we bring everything that we are generating that is relevant to the insurance sector, reinsurance sector, and present it to them in a way that makes them want to say, I want to use these services? For us to establish this presence in those sectors, it costs money. That word that wins the word bingo, collaboration, costs money. Dito to Bente, that data management, it wasn't open data or closed data. The effort to manage data in an agency to make it accessible, discoverable, and usable costs money. Even back at NOAA, folks were saying, unless it comes with money, I'm not going to reprogram my current resources to do that. And we see that in developing countries in particular. They want to organize all the data that they have in different agencies, in different archives, but that costs money. This year, we are delighted at Alice that GEO and GeoBon is going to be at Cali, showcasing the work of GEO that supports global biodiversity framework implementation. The theme of our booth, first time, GEO has a pavilion of our own at a convention. It's called From Genes to Ecosystems. There we will present all of the work that's being done with this GEO community in support of GBF. Guess what? $144,000 US is the cost of the pavilion. And that's on the cheap side because the event is taking place in Colombia. GEO does not currently have the operating resources, that muscle that you can flex however you need, whenever you need to do something. The storytelling workshops, the communications workshops, I'm with you. Let's organize those webinars. How can we bring the best communications experts to teach the skills? The reason I'm saying all of this is not to paint a grim picture. It's not that bad. Fortunately, we have some partners who are coming to help us. Our pavilion in Cali is the partnership with 2 private sector companies. That's how we are able to be in Cali. But any bit of coordination to bring 2, 3, 4 GEO projects together to create something new, I guarantee is going to require an additional resource who will take on that role of coordination. We've seen this happen. We can create webinars. We can pool all of you together who have a synergy opportunity. You'll have a fantastic discussion. And then at the end, we'll say, okay, great, next steps. Who can take on the lead to coordinate? And you will all be quiet. You know why? Because you have your day jobs. Say it ain't so. It is so. So for us to be able to then continue this work, it requires resources. Somebody, perhaps a young professional who wants the development opportunity to be a coordinator of the project. My wish is that GEO would have that operating capital to be able to flex its muscle when it needs to, how it needs to take these things off the ground. At Katie, who was calling for a demonstration of value of our initiatives in order to generate resources. That's a fantastic case. I love GeoGlows, I love GFY, I love GeoGlam, but these initiatives have taken 10+ years to get here. And it takes a willing donor in the beginning to provide seed funding, risk capital, development capital, so that it can be implemented, and 3-5 years down the road or sooner, we can have those tangible, quantifiable results for further scaling. So I think where I really would love for us to continue to unpack this is where in this space are going to our members and the inside of GEO own this process to provide those opportunities. And I think it goes back to what Andy said in one of his slides, the plan, the implementation plan that we're developing for the first time, we want to make it costed so that it's not just we seek to collaborate, to connect, to network, but so we identified the cost of that collaboration, the cost of the webinars, the cost of the communication, the cost of the visibility and the roles and the responsibilities, so that we can have a realistic implementation plan. I'm sorry if I'm putting a bit of a wet blanket here. That's certainly not the intention, but I did want to stay true, at least to myself and my comments earlier, to say we need to push further to really ask the questions. What are the necessary things for us to scale and grow at the pace that we've set in the strategy? And to be truthful in answering that question, we cannot come to the word funding at the very, very end. And we cannot speak about collaborations as though they come with magic dust. And all of you here really should feel comfortable to speak up, because for us to come to the Pacific, or for us to bring the Pacific to us, a lot goes into that. So thanks for letting me say it from our side, but I don't think we can really not talk about these issues as we are developing this actionable implementation plan.
Thanks for that, Yana. I'll hand it over to the panelists for any final comments.
Yep. So as you say, we can't sit in the room and ask for everything without costing. But there are, like anything, it requires resiliency and a diverse network. But of course, there are ways to get there. So within the context of something like the CBD, why isn't the GEF funding? Yeah, I'll be as brief as possible. So organizations like GEF have to realize that this kind of data is essential. That might take a lot of work, but of course, we can't reach targets without better data, and that includes Earth intelligence data. If we're talking about philanthropic funding, and I'm sure you've looked at them, organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Bezos Earth Foundation, the Half Earth Foundation, all of those should be funding this. And if they don't realize now why, then more people in rooms like this have to be talking to them. The next level is, of course, national funding, which I'm sure you have. Countries like China have already funded major initiatives, including funding South-to-South policy development. So a few years ago, I taught on a South-South course for policymakers where we were training them the importance of geospatial data and how it was relevant to their NBSAPs. Now, very few countries will do that, but some like China will. And given that China is under eco-civilization, as everyone in this room should now be aware, and under that umbrella have things like ecological conservation red lines, where they blended together their biodiversity targets, areas with ecosystem service provision and ecosystem fragility, because anyone can ignore a cute, cuddly bat. People can't ignore if there is going to be a landslide over their houses. And so by bringing together those forms of information, it made everyone in the nation have to pay attention. And I know China does not operate in the same way as other countries, but China is a country that is willing to invest in these forms of funding. So I think this is a dialogue that obviously we have to continue outside this room. But I think with more people pushing the case of GEO, we have more ways of tying into those streams of funding. And it is absolutely essential. And people in this room need to remember that we've got to take that message home with us, because otherwise it's a conversation we keep having about what we want to do. But as you say, unless we have the means to do it, it remains a conversation and theoretical rather than something we can realize.
Thank you. And I think, Franz, you had one final comment.
Brief one to answer your question. So we do fund, so from the European Commission with our research program Horizon, we do fund many projects, and most of that money, I would say, goes actually to young people who do their PhD in a research project funded from the European Union. So I think we do fund a lot of young people. We have in Horizon Europe, we had a number of topics worth 600 million euro, that's 660 million US dollar, who made a reference to GEO. So there is quite a lot of funding. The INPA for Development Cooperation has 100 million euro now spent for Earth observation for Africa in the GMES in Africa program, or a similar program, correct me if I'm wrong. So there is a lot of funding, there's a lot of money. The question is, how do you really build on that opportunities? And I think from other countries, US and China and so on, there is a lot. That's not the problem. But I do agree that the implementation plan probably needs to answer better the question, how do we do this? And I think we mentioned here in this panel quite some important points. How do we involve end users? How do we address them? How do we communicate with them? How do we build partnerships? This should be the key questions in my view.
Thank you for that, and thank you to the entire panel for their contributions. I think and Jana for your comments, I think we did have a great discussion, and really looking at the future, it's very clear that communication is key, identifying user needs from the get-go, involving a diverse community, youth, indigenous peoples is really important to developing our activities from the ground up to really communicate the value added that could then help us mobilize resources and really deliver on the kinds of activities we're looking for. I will just mention real briefly, you will see QR codes with little card on the cards at the table. They are for a survey meant to really get your input on the strategy implementation plan. So please take one, fill out the survey to provide more input. And also just note, we're now going to coffee break, and please know there are also interactive demonstrations going on at the same time. So while you're getting coffee, please visit all the different booths and learn more about their activities. So with that, thank you very much for a great discussion, and we look forward to your input on the strategy implementation plan.